Hey everybody, this is Joseph S. Samaniego, the author of the Carolingian Age book series, and I am here with another reaction video. And this one is, what would the British sailors eat when they were in Lord Nelson's Navy? Now, for those of you who don't know, Horatio Nelson was an admiral in the British Navy, and this was during the Napoleonic time period. He was actually killed in 1805 at Trafalgar aboard his ship, the HMS Victory, which was a massive sailing ship for its time period. But he went on to inspire a lot of tales, the Jack Aubrey series, the Master and Commander series, Horatio Hornblower series, and so he is the inspiration for a lot of our historical fantasy series at this point, what we would consider to be historical fantasy. So let us sit back and watch. This is done by Dan Snow, who is an amazing historian, one of my favorites historians. So I'm looking forward to seeing this.
Once our recruit had been rated, they would quickly learn that their entire purpose was to keep the ship moving, handling the lines, managing the sails. Everything was done to serve the ship. And it would be on-the-job training. They would be expected to get to grips with everything and fast.
If you're a deckhand, you need to be able to do everything.
Okay.
If someone's injured, someone becomes ill, everyone needs to have the skills. So
You need to learn the ropes.
Absolutely, yeah. So even if it's a case of when we had greener crew members, you have to get them up. They don't know what they're doing, and you have to talk them through it, and it's pretty miserable for them because it's windy and it's cold, and you're stood on one bit of rope and it's not pleasant, but you've got to expose them to it.
So he said you got to learn the ropes, and that's something that we say even now. You got to learn the ropes. You learn the ropes when you're doing things. I wonder if this is where it came from, in sailing ships. You learn the ropes because rope is a very important, integral part of a sailing ship. So I wonder if that's where that saying came from.
As well as learning the ropes, our recruit would have to learn the rhythms of life on board one of His Britannic Majesty's ships. Life that started pretty early. At 5 a.m. came the piercing scream of the boatswain's whistles. These tough characters moved through the ship, telling everyone it was time to get up. All hands up, ahoy! Then they came along with their knives and shouted, out or down, that's the word. And if you're still in your hammock, they'd cut the rope here and send you crashing to the deck. You're expected to stow your hammock, take it up to the deck and place it in the netting that surrounded the rails of the ship. And then it was time to give the ship a good clean.
That seems like a lot just to get out of bed in the morning. Wow.
Every single day, the ship's routine started with a thorough clean. Cleanliness was next to godliness in the Royal Navy of Nelson's time. In fact, Napoleon found himself a prisoner of the Royal Navy in 1815 after the Battle of Waterloo, and he commented, as did many, many foreign visitors, on how British ships were spotless. So the entire crew would have set to work scrubbing, brushing, swabbing the decks every single morning. There was a lot on those decks. The pitch and tar would have come off the rig. The animals that were kept aboard for fresh produce would have had their droppings all over the ship. And of course, there were hundreds of men living aboard, so they needed a good scrub. And that was one of the ways in which the Royal Navy kept incidents of disease in these tightly packed communities down.
Yeah, so that's very important. You definitely want to keep the ship clean because you're really in there. It's almost like you're on top of each other in a way. And then you have, like you said, you have the animals, which animal droppings can have a lot of diseases in them. Even without the droppings, the urine, the saliva can have a lot of diseases, the fleas, things like that. So you definitely want to keep clean. But also there's another important aspect of that. Having your crew cleaning keeps them busy. It's that old saying, especially if you ever worked in the kitchen like I have, if you got time to lean, you got time to clean. Well, it keeps you busy, and it keeps your mind occupied. So it helps with morale in a sense, because now you're not having them fight boredom on their own, but it also gives them something to stay occupied with, so that they're not thinking negative thoughts against their crew. As long as you're not overdoing it with the cleanliness. Like if this is just the job duties and everyone's doing their fair share, things are usually okay. So it's definitely there's a bunch of different folds to this cleaning aspect.
So they would have washed the decks down. Then they used these holy stones, basically bits of sandstone. Sand the deck down. Take a top layer of muck off it. And then you get your brushes or your swabs made of old rope. Wash that over the side. Looking very clean, that stretch of deck now, if you don't mind me saying.
After a hard morning of swabbing, our recruit would have earned themselves a spot of breakfast.
Now, contrary to the myth, sailors in Nelson's Navy actually ate pretty well. The Navy looked after its seamen. They had to, because they had to have the strength and the morale to sail and fight these enormous ships, particularly given the diet in the Georgian slums at the time. Sailors would have been very excited to have meat 4 days a week. On Saturdays, they had this, 2 pounds of salt beef. Now this looks slightly more appetizing than it would have looked back in the early 19th century. There the beef would have been packed into casks, perhaps for years on end, covered in salt to preserve it, and be so hard it was almost said to be like a piece of wood that you could varnish. Still, what a treat. You'd eat that alongside the carbohydrates, the famous ship's biscuits. These are baked hard in special naval facilities around Britain. They too could be packed in casks and transported over huge distances before they just fell apart. Even so, there are some legendary stories about just how hard and disgusting these got. The ship's cook cooked for the men, the ordinary and able seamen. The officers had their own cooks, their own supplies. They ate very well, thank you, back there at the stern of the ship. He'd take a great big vat, he'd pour in some meat, he'd pour in old bits of biscuit, and he'd create these kind of stews. There was a weird sort of slush that rose to the surface that he could skim off and do with it what he will. It was a perk of the job. You could sell them to rope makers, for example, to make them more resistant to wind and weather. The cook benefited from what was known as the slush fund. So this was on high days and
A slush fund.
holidays, but 3 days.
That's interesting. So yeah, we're getting kind of an idea of a lot of the language here. Yeah, I think we've all seen that image of these sailors eating tack or trying to forage when they get to islands or places for fruits and things. Red meat actually does help with scurvy. That's actually a very important aspect of red meat. So that's one reason why it was so important. Obviously, citrus is better, and that's another thing that would bring along. But that would only last so long, so you would have to have provisions. We've talked about in the barbecue video the idea of smoking meat and salting meat to preserve it. I did not know that you could go years, but I know like my grandmother would salt pork and hams, and so they would cut off the moldy bits of the salted parts, and then cut off underneath it, and it'd be just fine. So it's what we call country ham, but in really just salted pork. And there's a lot of salted beef. In the northern parts of Europe, they would salt and smoke fish. So yeah, it's definitely important and vital.
3 days a week, it was no meat for you. Instead, it was oatmeal, about half a pint of peas, and then equally dispersed amount of cheese, butter, and sugar.
Now that oatmeal will last a long time, so that's good to have. A lot of that stuff actually is meant to last, so it's definitely good to take on these month-long voyages.
It's said by modern nutritionists that the naval diet of the Georgian Navy gave seafarers about 5,000 calories a day, which is what you'd expect for young men doing a huge amount of heavy lifting. And all of that, of course, had to be washed down with something. Beer. Now again, the myth here is that the Navy drank nothing but grog, rum mixed with water and a bit of lemon juice. But in fact, beer was the staple drink. It wasn't the kind of full-strength beer we get nowadays. It's thought to be a little bit weaker, small beer. But they had a gallon a day. Now that wasn't quite as insane as it sounds, because our beer was probably better for you than most drinking water, which could have been pulled out of the Thames or somewhere like that. The brewing process meant that many of the microbes, many of the nasty diseases were killed off. And so beer stored in casks might keep the crew healthier than drinking water. Of course, when the beer ran out,
Yeah, so obviously, and we talked about this in the beer video. Beer helps makes things last longer. You don't have the bacteria that can get into stagnant water. They would take fresh water with them in these barrels, and a lot of times the water would start to go bad, because water will get bad. It'll breed insects and germs and bacteria, and it will get bad. It will get stagnant. You can get dysentery. You can get other illnesses from it. Beer doesn't have that same effect if it's brewed properly. It can last longer. Obviously, rum will as well. And then they water it a little bit to kind of help it to go further as far as crewmen. Still not something that they really had to do a lot of. So it was definitely something you wanted to take with you. It also added calories to your meal. And so that helped with rebuilding your body after a hard day's worth of work.
well, that's when you had to turn to the local tipple. If your ship was serving in the Mediterranean, you might take arak or wine, which needed a lot of watering down. If you were in the Caribbean, well, you're near the sugar plantations, and that meant rum, the famous grog. That was about 4 parts water to 1 part rum, lemon juice added to keep the scurvy away, and a bit of brown sugar as well. It should be said, predictably, that sailors were world-leading experts in smuggling their own supplies of booze aboard ship. Captains would supplement this basic diet wherever they could. They knew that a well-fed crew was likely to be a happy and effective crew. Nelson's letters are full of accounts of him trying to find decent food, drinks, water for his men, keep their health in good shape. And that meant captains started experimenting in the 18th century and early 19th, particularly when it came to scurvy, a disease they didn't quite realise caused by deficiency of vitamin C that led to complete debilitation and death. One way of dealing with scurvy was very unpopular. Sauerkraut, kept a long time, full of vitamin C, a superfood. A little more popular.
Yeah, and sauerkraut is fermented. So as we talked about in the beer video and we talked about in other videos, fermented foods last longer. And it helps to kill the bacteria and preserves it. So definitely good. And sauerkraut is awesome. If you've never eaten sauerkraut, I suggest eating it.
The lemon, replaced by limes later in the 19th century, but a very reliable way of keeping scurvy at bay. The Admiralty declared that when it came to food and drink, the sailors should be given the best of everything. And I think it would be quite a stretch to claim this was the best that Georgian Britain could offer. But certainly, compared to their peers on land or in other industries, the sailors of Nelson's Navy pretty well looked after. Welcome to the History Hit YouTube channel, which we are...
That's it. Yeah, History Hit, I definitely agree. Definitely think everyone should start watching them. Yeah, so a lot of people joined the military during this time period. Sailors, infantry, land military, really for the stability of life. They knew they could make a regular wage, number one, because at this point they really weren't conscripted anymore. These were militaries that were more or less controlled by the state, not so much by local lords or anything. Feudalism is gone. So they had a stable pay and meals. So if you were a person who, you might not be in line for a particular position in your family's shop, or maybe your family doesn't have a shop, you're laborers, you could go into the military and get some money and see the world, possibly, depending on. More than likely, yeah, you would have to fight. If you were on a sailing ship, you'd have to obviously take dangers and take risks there. But you had something. You had something going, and you were away from whatever you were trying to get away from. A lot of more well-off noble people would take that course as well because it gave them connections, and it gave them that kind of that notoriety. Like, hey, he was a colonel in the king's army. He was a colonel in the Fusiliers, things like that. So they would then use that as a way to advance their political career or their career elsewhere. And you can see that in a lot of shows on TV. And like I said, in fact, right there, Dan Snow kind of reacts to Master Commander, which he was really. I've seen that one. He's really good on that. Seriously though, if you ever want to see a great historian talk about especially British history, Dan Snow is really the one to watch. So that's been my time. I hope you've enjoyed this, and check back soon for more. Remember to like and subscribe, and don't forget to check out my books on Amazon, and we'll see you next time.